Thank you, Martin.
Larry King.
In person. And thank you, Yusuf, and thank you, John, for two excellent addresses. I think you both answered the question in your own way, but you both gave us a very good feel for where you are and why you're there. That was tremendous. I thought perhaps we could start on a personal note, and you obviously both extremely busy men. I'd be interested to know how you relax. John, how do you relax? Do you ever relax?
Relax here?
Relax at home?
Here.
Yeah.
I want to show.
No. What do you do when you're not working?
Oh.
What do you do to amuse yourself?
I am always working. That's the problem.
What do you dream of doing other than working?
Just walking. Sometimes I just
Walking.
walk. I just walk with my wife, and that's what I love doing.
Walking.
Just pacing.
Some people like walking.
Yeah.
Did you know the Jewish Hebrew word for ethics is
Okay.
halakha, which means walking?
That's a new one for me, so I will add that. Thank you.
Yusuf, how do you
Well,
enjoy yourself?
I don't have a wife like with John to walk with. So I'm basically, I mean, it's difficult sometimes with the legal profession. I think it's how you maintain that balance in your life. And I do a bit of sports here and there.
What sort of sports do you do?
Well, I used to play indoor football quite often. Obviously, it's slowed down a bit now with the time, but yeah. And I think sometimes it depends on the work. Sometimes work can be fun as well. Work can be play. So it depends what you make up of your day-to-day activities. I thought you enjoy lecturing.
No, I'll drink to that. My wife is always trying to make me stop working, and she doesn't realise how much I enjoy working. Now, make sure you speak. I was just told to make sure you speak closely into the microphone. Let me start with you, Yusuf, and ask you a question that I think is on many people's minds these days. Jihad, what does it mean? What is a Muslim's obligation? Explain that to us, please.
Okay. I think it's interesting that you raised that question, and I'm glad you raised it in accordance with the discussion, because there certainly is a misconception and a misunderstanding surrounding the word jihad. Now, firstly, people or the Western media would translate it as holy war. But as we all know, war in itself can never be holy. The Arabic word for holy war is al-harb al-muqaddasatu. Not jihad, it's al-harb al-muqaddasatu. Harb meaning war, muqaddasatu meaning holy, holy war. And in Islamic terminology, in Islamic texts, in the Qur'an itself, that terminology is non-existent. As Karen Armstrong, David, mentioned in her book, The Battle for God, that the first time that this word holy war gained credence was during the time of the Crusades, when Pope Urban II basically used the concept of holy war to liberate Jerusalem. But jihad per se, and I need to emphasize this, from the Quranic perspective, just like the word Islam and just like the word Muslim, is generic. If you look at the word itself, it's derived from the word jahada or jahadat. It basically means, and I think John will agree with me on this point here, the effort of, or the process of exerting oneself or involving oneself in some form of struggle or resistance. Now, it's a generic term. Sometimes that resistance or that struggle can take a physical form. But in its broad sense, and just to emphasize this, because I want people out here, and particularly Christians, to understand this, that the word jihad is used several times in the Qur'an, and in certain instances, it's used in the context of a non-Muslim engaging in jihad. So there's no holy connotation to this. And one particular example I'll give you, as you've asked me, David, is in Surah 29, verse 8. It speaks here about man being enjoined to be good to his parents. And what it says here, but if your parents, if your polytheistic parents, if they coerce you, or they engage in some form of duress to ask you to worship the pagan gods, then do not obey them in respect of that, but you bear them out good company in this life. Now, in the Arabic, in the word for coerce, or the word for engaging in some form of duress, is jahada or jihad. So in other words, if one were to transliterate that passage, it's basically saying that if your polytheistic parents are engaging in a jihad to force you to worship idols, then you do not obey them. But the point I'm trying to emphasize is that this term essentially is generic. It refers to a struggle or struggle for righteousness in the broadest connotation.
So, can I interrupt you there and just try and, I mean, Al-Qaeda, let's just think about Al-Qaeda for a moment. Do they see themselves involved in jihad? Are they misinterpreting it? What's your take on that?
Well, you know, that's a loaded question, David, because people have now even questioned the existence of the phenomenon of Al-Qaeda. As we would probably know, that the Al-Qaeda literally means the base, was a term which was given to a base in Afghanistan during the Afghan-Russian war by the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, by the CIA, when they were fighting America's war, and so they formed the base. But today, the idea of Al-Qaeda, I mean, technically speaking, if someone were to go to Midrand, people living in some squatter camp, and blow up one of the town halls here and say Al-Qaeda did it, we are from Al-Qaeda, it'll be world news, Al-Qaeda in Midrand. So, but the point I'm trying to emphasize is that it's very loosely used. It's a loose phenomenon. But it's unacceptable. If you're asking me about the philosophy of Osama bin Laden, what he stands for, that is an extreme perspective that he takes by atomizing scripture, and he's placed in that particular position as a result of certain political grievances that he might have. One needs to also understand the fact that bin Laden, for a significant part of his life, was an ally of the United States, particularly during the Jimmy Carter presidency. But the point, I think, the point you're trying to get to me is the manipulation of the term jihad, or the usage of the term jihad, perhaps by extreme elements. They engage in a process of decontextualization or an atomistic interpretation of scripture. When you speak about physical fighting, actual physical fighting, which is also can be viewed as a type of jihad, that kind of physical fighting is only allowed in the context of engaging in a defensive war. And once the aggression falls away, then that fighting needs to fall away. So, for example, you'd seen Surah 4 verse...
Hang on, let me interrupt there. I'm going to interrupt both of you a lot because we've only got 30 minutes and there's quite a number of questions. We could obviously spend our whole 30 minutes talking about jihad. But John, a very brief comment on any of that before we pass to another question. I think you've given us a good insight into your understanding of it.
Well, I think it's very interesting to hear Yusuf's perspective on jihad, because yes, jihad is in the Qur'an, and it talks about the Muslim jurists have talked about the term jihad over the centuries. And jihad has three meanings in Islamic jurisprudence. You have jihad of the heart, which means jihad against the self. You have jihad of the tongue, or jihad that you speak out against evil. And you have jihad of the hand, which is the jihad that you fight, physical jihad. And there are these different categories of jihad that Muslim jurists have talked about. And until the 20th century, jihad, when it was used in Muslim jurisprudence, simply meant jihad of the hand, the physical fighting. And that is all well documented in Islamic jurisprudence. But yes, Muslims have never agreed on the exact interpretation of, but it is certainly in the Quran, and the Quran encourages jihad. It encourages jihad of the hand, which is the physical jihad.
Well, David, could I just a quick one on that? I think, John, you'd probably note that is not entirely correct, because I stated that the word jihad is used in a generic context in the Quran. And the context, for example, where physical fighting is actually used, in Surah 2 verse 190, it says, fight those who engage in aggression against you. But once they cease from their hostilities, then you are to cease as well. Then it says in Surah 4 verse 75, why should you not fight in the cause of men, women, and children whose plea is liberate us from these oppressors. So in the context that fighting for the sake of fighting is never allowed in Islam, actual physical fighting can only be engaged in the context of a defensive war. In fact, there's not a single passage in the Qur'an which speaks about physical fighting outside the context of a defensive war.
Well,
Unless, of course, you atomize it and you want to take it out of context. But of course, we can, and I'm interested in seeing during the question and answer session how we
Okay.
can unpack this more.
That may come up again. I'm going to sort of dance around a little bit and try and cover as much ground as we
Yeah.
possibly can. John Azumah, Yusuf said some very interesting things towards the end of his address about slavery. You, I believe, were a slave at one point. I don't think there are probably many of us here who can make that boast, if it is a boast. But I'd be interested to hear your feelings, your response to what Yusuf was saying.
yeah, I thought Yusuf was really treading on very dangerous grounds there. I did my PhD on Islamic slavery. I have a whole chapter on Islamic slavery in Africa. And I think what Yusuf was doing there was really doing a very disservice to the history of slavery in Africa. I think what Yusuf did there was quoting the teaching of one religion and putting it against the practice of one religion. And we can all do that. You don't compare the teaching, the ideals of one faith against the practice of another. Slavery is a well-known practice in Islam long before even the transatlantic slave trade. And slavery started in the 7th century, and the Prophet himself had slaves, and all his people had slaves. It is good to quote from the Qur'an. The Qur'an says, treat your slaves well, and all those pious teaching. But again, you've got to put that down to where the practice was on the ground. And I have done quite a good survey on the history of slavery in Muslim Africa. Now, on the whole question of slavery, you said that Western powers never abolished slavery properly. That is interesting because there has never been a proper, consistent voice in Islamic history against slavery. We had a lot of abolitionists from a Western perspective against slavery, and the movement against slavery, in fact, was fought against by Muslims in Africa. And I'm speaking as someone who comes from a community that we suffered slave trade and the slave raids from Muslims, people who happen to be Muslims. So I'm saying that slavery did take place, and you talked about the Quran talking about the freeing of slaves. But again, the interesting thing, Yusuf, is that slavery lasted in Islam centuries after slavery was abolished in the West. There is still slavery today in Sudan. There is still slavery today in Mauritania. There is still slavery today in the Middle East.
Let's
just finish the point. That the Arabic word for black people is abid. Abid means slaves. And if you go to North Africa, in contemporary Arabic language, they speak and they refer to black people as abid. It's just like the word Negro that has been there, that has been used. And you can't deny that slavery existed.
Okay,
Let me respond.
hang on, let me interrupt here. I was about to interrupt and say that
Okay.
I'm sort of relieved that we're all against slavery now.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
He was a slave.
And maybe you want to make a comment.
Absolutely.
Yusuf.
I think one thing we need to understand, David, is that I appealed to the audience. I said, please make a distinction between slavery as it is found in the actual sources, that's a text, and slavery in other religions. And I think the distinction we need to understand here is the following, David. That there might have been, I'm not here to defend the Arab slave trade, and certainly Arabs and Muslims engaged in acts of slavery. You look at the Fatimid dynasty, you look at certain instances like the Mamluks, for example, in Egypt that were slaves, but they engaged in a coup and they subsequently became rulers in Egyptian society. But that's besides the point. Slavery did exist in Muslim countries. The point I was trying to emphasize is that look at the distinction of slavery as an institutionalized practice in Scripture And the point I was trying to emphasize is that in Scripture, slavery is institutionalized in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It does not exist in the Islamic tradition. And the example I wanted to give, but because of lack of time, was the following quotation, for example. If you were to look at the Levitical laws in Exodus 21, verse 5 to 6, it says, "And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever." Leviticus 25:44, "But thy slaves and slave girls which thou shalt have shall be of the heathen, and thou about you. And as for the male and female slaves which you have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves." Luke 12:47, "And that servant which knew not his Lord's will and prepared not himself shall be beaten with stripes." Now, we don't have any passages like that